Resistance. The same resistance that exists inside an electric shower. You may have heard that this type of appliance consumes a lot of electricity, and that's correct. Many question why people were not electrocuted, or why the ship did not completely lose power when water came into contact with the electrical wiring. Ships like Titanic were designed to float, even with a limited number of flooded compartments. Well then, submerging the electrical circuit in certain areas was also part of the designer's plans, and that is why the electrical network was divided to function as follows. If Titanic suffered a collision and had 2 compartments flooded, the water would rise up to the electrical circuits of those compartments, causing a local blackout. Remember resistance. When we connect 2 wires with different potentials in water, it produces heat. The lower the resistance, the higher the electric current. To increase resistance, we need to increase the area of contact of the wires in the water. In this way, the electric current increases. If the electric current increases, the wires overheat. That's why our wires melted and went into short circuit. At the beginning of Titanic's sinking, the resistance kept decreasing because there were more and more points of contact with the saltwater. This causes the electric current to decrease in other lamps, resulting in the visible flickering of lights. There comes a point where the resistance is so low that the electric current causes the distribution panel to explode, and the system breaker simply trips. In the final moments of the sinking, when the water arrives more rapidly, the points of contact with the saltwater increase so quickly that the electric current causes the wiring or lamps to explode even before the breaker can trip. When the water reached the deck, some survivors reported that the lights appeared reddish and flickering. This happened because the resistance was so low, with so many points of contact with seawater, that the electric current was no longer enough to keep the remaining lights on Titanic lit. The generator of Titanic was at its limit. Never had it produced so much electricity in such a short time, but all this power was being directed to the points of contact with saltwater, and almost nothing was left for the ship's lights. In other words, it was as if Titanic's generator was producing electricity for dozens or hundreds of electric showers, overloading the system and causing the main switch to trip. At this stage, resetting the main switch would direct a large amount of electric current, potentially causing an electric arc for anyone who dared to restart the system. Below the decks, in boiler room number 2, water begins to cascade down the top of the stairs like a strong torrent. There are still some men there who had worked tirelessly for hours to keep Titanic's electrical system functioning. But now remaining there becomes impossible. The cold seawater comes into contact with the still heated boilers, fed until the very last moment to sustain the electricity on board. Overheated, the boilers explode, breaking down the watertight door. The water then advances violently, and, interestingly, its sudden movement stabilizes the ship again. In the wreckage of Titanic, it is still possible to see the piping that connected boiler room number 2 to the turbine that powered the dynamo responsible for generating the ship's electricity. The valve remains visibly open, indicating that steam was still being released there at the moment Titanic sank. Observe how the boilers are bent inward. This happened due to the contact of cold seawater with the boilers of room number 2. In this example, we will heat a soda can and then place it in cold water. The temperature difference causes the boiler to implode, creating a frightening implosion sound reported by passengers and Titanic officers. A wave invades the deck, and it becomes weaker and weaker. In the British inquiry, Lightoller provided more details when he reported that he saw First Officer Murdoch. He said he was practically the last man, and certainly the last officer, to see Mr. Murdoch. He said that Murdoch was striving to launch the collapsible boat on the starboard side, and he himself was working on the port side of the ship. Mr. Murdoch was working hard, personally helping lower the collapsible boat. At that moment, the ship plunged, and we were all in the water. Murdoch died like a man, fulfilling his duty. Even so, both in his book and in testimonies given in the US and British inquiries, he mentioned only a crowd of people on the deck. Titanic historian Don Lynch observed that Lightor's testimony about Murdoch can certainly be questioned, and it is possible that he tried to protect the reputation of a fellow White Star officer, as well as his employers. Evidence suggests that First Officer Murdoch managed to prepare lifeboat number 1 for launching. a detail still visible in Titanic's wreck. One of the davits that would be used to lower the collapsible is still turned inward, which means the water swept the deck before the boat A could be hooked and lowered. Murdoch's final fate remains surrounded by controversy. Now, having miniature ships has never been so easy. At 3D Monique, you will find dozens of impressive models, from famous ones like Titanic in various versions, or rarer ones like Oceanic or Poseidon. Visit our website 3DMK and be amazed by models that float, sink, or come in various scales. Soon we will have a big novelty with multicolor models. Visit our Instagram at 3DMINC and don't miss any updates. Captain Smith appears shouting through a megaphone telling everyone to go to the starboard side to keep the ship afloat as long as possible. In his book, Charles Lightoller describes that he was being assisted by lamp trimmer Samuel Hemming to launch collapsible lifeboat B. Samuel Hemming reported seeing 6th Officer James Moody for the last time helping push boat A from the roof of the officers' quarters. Ready to tip the boat from the officers' quarters roof to the deck, they noticed water submerging the floor as if a sea wave had arrived. Near Lighter, officers Murdoch and Moody prepared collapsible A to be pushed onto the deck. There is no doubt that James Cameron, the director of the 1997 Titanic film, was accurate in how the water swept the deck. With water rapidly rising above the deck, they were only able to push the boat and let it float, hoping that a few could reach it while it floated. In desperation and agony, collapsible B ended up falling upside down onto the deck shortly before the water rose and completely covered the area. Followed by the sound of a muffled explosion, a huge wave hits the bridge and spreads across each side of the boat deck. A group of men is pushed off the deck, and it is likely that First Officer Murdoch is among them. All were certainly dragged down by the ship. There are many reports stating that Captain Smith was in the middle of that chaos, trying to help those people until his last moment. When the bridge sank, accounts became confused between saying the captain jumped from the bridge or went into the wheelhouse. This gave artistic freedom to many films. A highlight is the 1997 film, where the captain awaits his end calmly in the wheelhouse. The truth is that no one knows exactly what happened, the most likely being that Smith, Murdoch and Moody were in different places, pulled down by the ship when water swept the forward boat deck. Colonel Archibald Gracie refers to Chief Officer Henry Wilde being carried away by the water at that moment. The body of Officer Henry Wilde was never recovered. Therefore, his cause of death cannot be confirmed or denied. Reports of a shooting and suicide appear soon after the disaster, and the term Chief Officer and the name Wilde began to appear. According to the Titanic Explorer CD-ROM by James Cameron, rumors persist to this day that he committed suicide on the boat deck during the sinking. Additionally, researcher of Murdoch Richard Atkins developed what he calls the Wilde hypothesis. The Wilde hypothesis is a theory that postulates that Henry Tingle Wilde, the chief officer of RMS Titanic, committed suicide aboard the ship in the final hours of the sinking. This speculation arose from journalistic reports of the time that frequently mentioned the officer shooting himself on the boat deck. Researchers proposed this hypothesis through a process of elimination, arguing that, given the way the other officers likely died, Moody falling into the sea, Smith and Murdoch sinking with the ship, Wilde would be the most probable candidate for suicide, especially because his body, like those of Moody, Smith and Murdoch, was never recovered. Newspapers such as News of the World of April 21, 1912, even published anonymous reports claiming that Officer Wilde raised his arm and shot himself. At this stage of the sinking, Captain Smith, Chief Officer Wilde, First Officer Murdoch and 6th Officer Moody are lost forever. In the distance, 3rd Officer Pittman, 4th Officer Boxhall, and 5th Officer Lowe observe the gigantic Titanic submerging rapidly. On board the vessel still remains 2nd Officer Lightoller. Along with him, hundreds of souls who have death as their only destination. In his book, Lightoller paints a dramatic picture of Titanic's sudden plunge. The ship gave a slight but definite plunge, probably because of a bulkhead that collapsed, and the sea rose like a wave over the bridge and along the deck below us, dragging people back in a terrible, piled-up mass. Those who did not immediately disappear under the water instinctively began to climb a part of the deck that was still above water, making their way toward the stern, which was rising constantly as the bow sank. It was a sight not worth dwelling on, standing there on top of the wheelhouse, watching the frantic struggle to climb the sloping deck. I knew very well the complete futility of following that instinct of self-preservation by running toward the stern. It would only delay the plunge and prolong the agony. It became clear to me how fatal it would be to remain among those hundreds and hundreds of people who would soon be fighting for their lives in that cold, deadly water. There was only one thing to do, and I might as well do it and get it over with. So, turning toward the forward part of the bridge, I dived headfirst into the water. Hitting the water was like feeling 1,000 knives being driven into the body, and for a few moments I completely lost control, while the seawater, at a temperature I do not know how many degrees below zero, punished my body. Lightoller continues saying, "I was swimming toward the bow of the ship, toward the crow's nest. I could not see the nest in front of me. The water was intensely cold, and the natural instinct was to try to get out of it. I do not know if I even swam to the foremast with that idea, but soon I realized it was foolish. Then I turned and began to swim away from the ship toward the starboard side. The next thing I noticed was that I was trapped in the exhaust, at the front of the first funnel. There was so much water being sucked there that it held me for a time. As much as I tried to get out, the current held me, and I was drowning. I could only ask for divine help. After some time, a rush of air seemed to come from below and carried me away from the exhaust. At that moment, I felt that God had saved me. I found myself next to a collapsible boat that I had launched earlier on the port side. I held onto something and stayed there for a while, and then the forward funnel collapsed. It fell about 1 meter from the boat. A wave lifted the boat and threw it about 6 meters away from the ship. That was the closest I could judge. By that time, the front part of the ship was already sinking fast, while the stern rose higher and higher out of the water. People crowded onto the sloping decks, helpless, until they fell one by one into the freezing water. If the boats had been nearby, many could have been saved, but at that moment there was no sign of help. No one could help anyone. Now, having miniature ships has never been so easy. At 3DMINC, you will find dozens of impressive models, from famous ones like the Titanic in various versions, to rarer ones like the Oceanic or the Poseidon. Visit our website 3DMK and be amazed by models that float, sink, or come in various scales. Soon we will have a big new release with multicolor models. Visit our Instagram at Darkillusionist and don't miss any updates.